I am really excited to bring this to you today. We're going to talk about bringing dialogue to life. We're going to talk about how to be memorable, playable, and fun with your dialogue and actually engage the player. There is a lot to get through. As you might imagine, there's a lot to talk about with dialogue, so I would ask that you hold questions until the end. Hopefully there will be time to do a Q&A. If for some reason there isn't, you are all welcome to DM me and we will have a conversation that way. But hopefully most of your questions will be answered. This is going to be a pretty non-technical lecture in that I'm not going to be talking about, how to place an implementation note of a persuasion check having 25 or 50 as their limit. That sort of thing you can find in a really great guide that Thingy Person actually just released. And of course, you can look at examples on the writing page. This is a little bit more large scale, what dialogue is, why you use certain things, and other aspects of it that you can bring into your writing that will make it more complete, more whole. So here's what we're going to cover today. Purpose and differences in dialogue. Why do we use dialogue? How do we use dialogue? Finding your rhythm. Oh my God, this is always overlooked and it is so important. Hidden rewards, how to incorporate things that the player doesn't immediately see but can discover. Boy, can that make a difference in your play. And then making it interesting, just on a very, very core level, what makes something interesting to the player in your dialogue. And then a Q&A at the end. So just a quick mechanics reminder for those of you who are not as familiar with the dialogue structure, the format. You're going to be seeing a couple examples and they're going to be in this format. 149 characters for the NPC, 80 for the player. I didn't make these rules. Bethesda made these rules. I can't change them. There are ways to get around the NPC limit by breaking lines and just doing 2 lines. There is no way around the player character limit. So always be very conscious when you are writing that you cannot do a player line that is long. It's just not possible. Implementation notes and other colored notes change depending on the project that you are affiliated with. Some use different colors than others. All of them will use colors for these specific instances. Implementation notes, repeated lines, and voice acting notes will always be set apart in some way. So it's good to get in the habit of doing that and of reading that. In the AU, a lot of people just use purple for implementation notes. That's fine. I use red as well for my dialogue notes. So you'll be seeing that in my examples. You don't have to do it that way, but do know that that's a way to do it. So that's just some quick mechanics. Not most of what we're going to be talking about, but still good to know. So, dialogue. Why do we do dialogue? Well, because we're gamers, and that's what makes gaming fun if you're going to do an RPG. But dialogue has 2 essential elements to it, 2 reasons why you would use dialogue in a game. One is to impart information. Where is the monster and how do you kill it? How do you get from one place to another? What do you do next? This is very, very important to dialogue. Otherwise, your character, your player is just wandering around with no idea of what to do. And while that is certainly a game style for other types of games where you just have to figure it out on your own, that's not really what Skyrim is about, and that's not really what we do. We want to impart information to the players so that they can continue along their way with some sense of what they're doing. The other purpose of dialogue is to impart character, and this is what builds a world. These dialogue interactions are the ones that tell you not only what to do, but who a person is, what a place is about, what sets this particular location or group of people apart from other people. And so imparting character through dialogue, really important in making these places come to life. I mean, imagine if Skyrim was only the quest dialogue, and you never found out about any of the NPCs, you never found out about any of the cities, you had no idea about the place that you were in, the history, the lore, the religion, you would be bored out of your mind because you'd just be running around. So both of these aspects of dialogue are vitally important. I have a little warning here at the bottom. Dialogue does not work the way it does in novel writing. And I know we have a lot of people who have written novels or write creatively as well. In novel writing, you can spend a page and a half talking about what a character's backstory is and what they look like and basics like that. And you don't have that kind of time in a game. You just simply do not. My favorite example of this is actually Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame, where he devotes an entire chapter to the rooftops of Paris and what they look like in the sunlight and the colors and the textures of these rooftops. If you tried to do that in a game, you would be absolutely massacred in reviews. Nobody would want to play that because in games, you need to keep some sense of forward motion. It can be faster, it can be slower, but the dialogue needs to help move things forward. The story needs to progress. Otherwise, there is no sense of why you should keep playing. So know that dialogue doesn't work like novel writing does. There has to be very distinct moments of purpose to everything. Everything's got to matter, which we will get to even more at the end. So here are some differences that people don't always take into account between standard dialogue and quest dialogue. And for those who don't know, standard dialogue is when you go up to an NPC and you say hi, and they talk about themselves, or they talk about the city, or they talk about anything they want to talk about with you. And that dialogue stays the same, hence it being called standard dialogue. And it has its own aspects as opposed to quest dialogue. Quest dialogue, the player is looking for something or someone. They're looking for information. They're looking to continue along a quest, not just build a world. So standard and quest dialogue have very different requirements. Standard dialogue is optional. And for example, I give you Nils, who is the cook up at Candlehearth Hall, and that's all he says. He doesn't even have dialogue, but he's still there. He's still an NPC, and he can just go about his business and be part of the atmosphere. You can't do that with quests. Quest dialogue is what brings a quest forward, so it can't be optional. You need that moment where the priestess tells you where the child is hidden or whatever it is. You need that to continue. You don't need standard dialogue. You can ignore absolutely everybody in Riften and still get a sense of where you're going and the playthrough. You can still function that way without standard dialogue. It's boring, but it's doable. Quest dialogue required. Standard dialogue is character driven. This is where you build your world. If you tried to build the world in quest dialogue, your player would get very, very anxious and bored and impatient because quest dialogue needs to be directionally oriented, where standard dialogue can be a lot more diffuse, can give a lot more atmosphere than quest dialogue can. We're going to get into what checks exactly are and what you can do with them in a second, but know that standard dialogue is where your checks should be, most of them. These are things like persuasion checks. These are also other elements like faction checks, which we will get into. But checks essentially stop the action, and they put up a little barrier, and if the player doesn't have what it takes to cross that barrier, they don't get the information that they would otherwise get. If they don't have a high enough speech skill, if they aren't part of a certain faction, they don't get that information. If you do that in a quest, bad things happen because nobody wants to play half a quest, get to an NPC they need to talk to, and then be blocked out of important quest information by a persuasion check or something like that. Because then the player, if they have any sense of math, will go, oh, I need 12 more persuasion points to, speech skills to pass this persuasion check. And then they'll give up. because they'll have to go and do other things to get those skills up. They'll forget that the quest happened. It'll be stuck in their journal forever, and you as a quest writer have failed at your job, which is to keep them engaged with the quest that you are writing. So checks, not necessarily a great thing for quests, but fabulous for standard dialogue. So here are two more aspects to consider when you are looking at sort of the meta big picture of dialogue: difficulty and urgency. Difficulty is a little bit misnamed because it makes it sound like it's about being on legendary difficulty or something like that. It's not. It's about how hard it was for the player to get that dialogue. If the player can walk into the middle of Whiterun and just walk up to an NPC and say hi and have a dialogue, the player has done nothing to earn that dialogue. They have gone through no trials. They're just walking up to someone and saying hi. So that dialogue should be shorter, should be more choice-based, doesn't need to be anything in particular. If you have climbed 7,000 steps and fought a troll, even though you were at a very low level to do so, you deserve to have some good dialogue at the end of that. If you went up the 7,000 steps and went to talk to Arngeir and he just went, yeah, here's how you shout, and just left it at that, you would feel cheated as a player because you had gone through so much to be able to talk to this person or these people. And therefore, if you are writing a character that the player has to do a lot to get to, you have more leniency in terms of the length of your lines. You can be more talkative. You can say a lot more because the player is ready to listen. They've done a lot, and now they're getting their reward in terms of dialogue. If you haven't gone through that, then you need to be a bit more judicious with your dialogue. Otherwise, the player is going to want to move on. Urgency is the other big factor. If your player is being pursued by the Penitus Oculatus and there's a time limit on what they need to do and they need to find someone super fast, you don't have time to hear about the NPC's daughter and his relationship with her and how it's sort of dissolved and how he wishes things were like they were before. You don't have that kind of time. As a player, you want to continue playing. But if you were to meet, say, a hermit in the woods and there is no sense of urgency, you can be a lot more detailed there. The player can choose to hear or not hear different aspects of the NPC's life and find out more about them or not in their own time. So keep a hold of the sense of urgency that the player is experiencing when they talk to your NPC and when they engage in dialogue. So that's some of the big considerations. Now let's talk really, really small, which is finding the rhythm of your dialogue. It's a difficult concept to illustrate without getting very, very deep and technical. So I am going to use some very, very tiny measurements. And you do not need to do this with yours, though it is a good idea sometimes. You'll see what I mean in a second. Speed of delivery. The average actor speaks at 120 to 150 words a minute in English. The average person speaks slower than that, but actors know what they're going to say, so they can say it a bit faster. Figure that your voice actors are going to be about that, 120 to 150. Any faster than 150, and they are rushing, and it's harder to understand. So every good voice actor knows you don't rush your lines, you take your time. That means a lot for writers because it means that timing becomes essential even when we are not thinking about it. There are pitfalls that writers can experience related to timing without even realizing it that will actually mess up the flow of the gameplay in ways that we don't think about, because we don't think about how fast the voice actor is going to say these things. We just think about the progression of events. Here are some common pitfalls and why they are a problem. Shortlining. So this one I see a lot, and it is so tempting to do. Honestly, this one is so tempting. If you look at the length of the lines of the NPC here, each one of them takes 1 to 2 seconds to say. And what that turns into is this. Welcome to Riften. Click. Yes, I am. Click. It's all right, I guess. Click. Thieves, lots of them. Click. Yes, they have a big guild here. Click. A friend of a friend told me. Click. Bye. That is not a dialogue. That is clicking. If the player is spending more time reading the lines that they're going to click than they are listening to the lines that the NPC is saying, it's almost impossible not to be drawn out of the world of the game and into the fact that you are clicking. Also, not for nothing, but this dialogue tells you nothing at all about the person who is speaking. We don't know anything about them. We have not learned anything. We have not grown. We don't know. And so this whole dialogue essentially becomes pointless, because we're racing through it as writers to get to the end and to finish up with this NPC and move on. So tempting to do, and it is okay to occasionally include a single short line, but long short lining like this, just short line, short line, short line, short line, does nothing for your writing. Here's how you fix it without becoming extremely long-winded. This is the same conversation, but all of the lines have been changed so that they're 4 to 7 seconds long. This allows you, as a player, time to register what they're saying. It also means that you can establish who is speaking, what they're talking about, and why they're saying that. So look at the question, are you a native of the city? Yes, I am. Lived here all my life, in fact, never saw a reason to leave. Now you know this is a homebody character. This is an NPC that doesn't travel, that doesn't feel the need to expand their horizons. They feel comfortable at home. You didn't know that before because the only answer was, yes, I am. Yes, I am is a yes or no question. It doesn't really tell you much. Notice that none of these lines are more than 1 line long. These are still single lines. They're still pretty short, and there's no real big branching going on either. So this is still a very straightforward dialogue, but it is enough to expand these lines to make a character and to make someone seem like a real person when speaking, and to eliminate that sense that the player is just clicking, 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 clicking to move on. So here's the opposite of shortlining, monologuing. Monologuing is even more tempting because we want to get our point across. And if you look at this, I'm just going to read a little bit of it aloud. Can you tell me about the city? Why, certainly. There's a great deal to tell. The city of Whiterun is split into 3 districts, the Plains District, the Wind District, and the Cloud District. Each one sits upon a different tier, like steps. The Plains District occupies, and right there, that's where the player stops paying attention. Because the player realizes you're about to describe all 3 of the districts. And if they've ever played Skyrim before, they don't need to know that information. They know what Whiterun is. They've been there a lot. But if you're a player who's playing for the first time, this could actually be interesting to you. You could actually find out a lot about the city if you talked to this NPC. So there's a way to fix this. Oh, also notice 59 seconds. No one wants to sit there for 59 seconds hearing about the districts of Whiterun. No one. But here's how you fix this in a way that will give information, will not necessarily take away from what you've written, but will engage the player. Breaking it up with player lines. Can you tell me about the city? 2 lines. Then you have Tell me about the Plains District, tell me about the Wind District, and tell me about the Cloud District. And then a final one, is there anything else I should see? If the player knows about the districts, they don't have to click on these things. They can jump straight to the end and then they're done. That's a 4-line dialogue. That's fine. If they do click on one of these things, like the Plains District, chances are they're going to click on all of them because none of us like the feeling that we've left something incomplete. So you're still going to be able to impart the information that you want to impart, but allow the player a chance to decide that they're going to find out more, not be forced into watching. The last thing you want is a spectator moment in your game where your player is just sitting there listening and waiting for the dialogue to end. That's not engaging. And the reason we play games rather than just watching movies or reading books is that we can be part of them. So allowing the player to make that choice is vital to keeping your game moving forward and to keeping the rhythm of speaking and listening and speaking and listening. Notice also that Tell Me About the Plains District has 2 lines to answer. So does Tell Me About the Wind District. But when you get to Tell Me About the Cloud District, it's only 1 line. This is an important yet tiny little thing that you can add to your dialogue. Our brains, as humans, think in terms of rhythm very naturally. And if we know that the response is going to be a certain amount of time, we ask, tell me about the Plains District, and it's going to be however long 2 lines takes, and Wind District 2 lines takes, a part of us stops paying attention because we know how long it's going to be. We know how much is going to be imparted. If you then shake it up by having a 1-liner, just a single shorter response, the brain needs to pay attention again. We can't zone out in the same way. We can't predict what is going to be said and the length of what is going to be said. So keep that variety in your dialogue, and it'll stay fresher for your player. So now we're going to talk about logical flow, which is a mistake, well, many mistakes, but a type of mistake that I think you are actually more prone to do when you are more experienced with writing, because you forget that certain progressions simply don't happen. So I'm going to show you a section of dialogue, and I'm just going to be quiet for 5 seconds, and you take a look at it, and then afterwards I will tell you what is wrong with it. But let's see whether you can spot it first. So what you should be looking at here is direction. And that's hard to see right off the bat because we look at this and we see a conversation. We see, welcome to Riften. I hope you enjoy your stay. What should I look out for? Oh, thieves, lots of them in every nook and cranny, but especially the ratway that runs underneath the city. The ratway, what's that? It's a sort of sewer system, etc. But the way that this is actually structured, 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 are vertical. That means all of them could be chosen. That's your branch right there. So that means you could technically say, welcome to Riften, I hope you enjoy your stay. The ratway, what's that? Which makes no sense. You have not established what the ratway is or even that it exists, so you would never ask that. This dialogue needs to be on the diagonal. It needs to be one after another, so that these questions can be answered. It can go back and forth as a question-answer, not as a branch where you can choose which one to go for. So avoiding the non sequitur of this is tricky, but it's worth doing. Always read through your dialogue from the beginning choice all the way through to a back to options or end dialogue moment, so you can see how it flows and make sure that you don't end up with the ratway, what's that, following welcome to Riften. Here's another one. I'll give you a couple seconds on this one. So this one seems perfectly straightforward and like no one would ever do this. And no one would ever do this in a tiny little short snippet. But if your dialogue is longer, this one becomes quite the trap. We like to finish and come to a conclusion and come to the same final line or final idea as writers because it allows us to bring everything back together and continue on from there and say goodbye and give a last bit of information. And that's great. But following along and making sure that every single step of the way, the answers match the question or the remark by the player and don't just repeat lines is trickier than you might think. So, screw you, I'll do what I want just does not lead into careful for thieves, they're everywhere. But if you had this in a longer progression, you might think it did. Again, going back to reading aloud, ideally, your dialogue from the first line all the way through to the end on every branch. And the last one actually is just an ordering thing. Look at this. You have, what can you tell me about the city? You have, thanks, I better be going. And you have, how long have you lived here? Technically, there is nothing wrong with this. However, the way we work as humans is we work beginning, middle, end. And you have your initial questions of what can you tell me about the city? How long have you lived here? And then you have your end, thanks, I'd better be going. The convention, and rightly so, of ordering is that you have to have goodbyes be at the end because we read top to bottom. So we read in order the questions that we can ask, followed by our way to get out of the conversation. This one really becomes a problem when you decide that you want to add another option. Like if I didn't know that I was going to write, how long have you lived here? And then I think, ooh, that would be a good idea. She can say this, this, this. I would be tempted to just add it because that would mean that I didn't need to change all my numbering. But you have to add it above and have I'd better be going be at the end. Otherwise, just the lineup doesn't work mentally. So these are your three basic logical flow problems, but you can avoid them by reading through them and by keeping in mind what's your beginning, what's your middle, and what's your end. Let's talk about branching. This is really, really important in your dialogue and also in your quest writing. We're mostly going to talk about dialogue today, but think about this in terms of the larger scale as well. Branching is what makes things fun. So why branch? And then the different types of branching and ways that you can use outs as well. And why do we branch? Well, one, it's what makes games interesting and not just episodes of clicking. Because if you just continue to click linearly onward and onward and onward, you aren't really interacting with the game. You're just essentially turning pages. You're not doing anything. So interaction is when you have choice. Branching allows you to have that. Branching also allows role play, where you can choose an option that the writer gives you that will make you seem more this or more that. If you are playing an evil necromancer, you don't want to choose the same options that you would if you were playing a gallant knight. And branching is what allows that to happen. But the last one is replayability, because all of us want to know everything that's going to happen in a game. And branching means you can't. You can't know every dialogue option and every dialogue response if there's branching, which means you think things like, oh, I'll go back and I'll ask her that on my next playthrough. And as soon as you're thinking of your next playthrough, you're more engaged in the game, you're more likely to keep playing. This is what we want as game writers. So replayability is one of the core aspects of why branching matters. So what types of branching are there? Well, lots. but we're going to cover 3. Divergent branching is when everything goes in different directions. First, if you follow the black line here, you hit your green branch there, and you can go to the red line, or you can go to the blue line. Then if you're along the blue line, you can branch again and be either continuing along the blue line or the pink line. Divergent branching works really well in standard dialogue because it allows you to go in different directions with a character's backstory or with information on what the character thinks about their world, about other people, about their town. You can find out a lot through divergent branching. Divergent branching does not work as well in quest writing because certain information needs to be imparted to the player. If you remember back to what we were talking about with the differences between standard and quest, dialogue is about moving the character forward. If you have divergent branching, you still need to get that same information across, but you need to get it across 3 different ways. So either you're using the same dialogue, which is hard if you're trying to do divergent branching for different character choices, for different role play choices, you wouldn't necessarily have that, or you need to say the same thing 3 different ways. Divergent branching also leads to a lot of dialogue for your voice actors to record, which for us, we're working with very generous voice actors most of the time who don't mind that, but it's still nice to keep in mind that their time matters as well. If you branch with divergent branching, you end up 3 different places as well. So that can be in terms of your relationship with the NPC you're talking to. That can mean that you have different information going forward. There are pitfalls to it. It is not necessarily better than being linear, but it is more interesting. And it does inspire you to want to go back and play again. So there are good things about divergent branching, certainly. However, convergent branching exists. This is full convergence. This is when you split off, do your own thing, and then come back, meet up, and have the end be the same. This is really nice to use because it checks all the boxes. It makes the player wonder what would happen if they'd chosen a different path. It allows you to get information across, but for shared information, you can keep that at the end, so you only have to say it once. There are a lot of great things about full convergent branching. The one big problem with it is that you don't have a chance to change your mind. You don't have a chance to change the sort of responses you're giving. You just have to stick with what you started with. Once you're on the red path, you're on the red path until it finally converges. Same thing for the blue path, which is why partial convergence exists. Partial convergence is when you branch the same way you would for divergent branching, but your second branch, where we would before have had that branch to the pink one and the blue one and had 3 different ways of ending, this allows you this way to get back to the red branch, to return to the other option and finish out the dialogue from there. Convergent branching gives the illusion that there are more choices than there are. It means you only have to write 2 branches and then a couple of choices, which is nice as a writer. But it also means that the player thinks they have control, and that's a good feeling as a player. You think that you are in charge of what's going on, but you're still on these 2 tracks. Just the red track and the blue track are your only choices. It's just whether you're going back and forth between them. Partial convergence does not work well with replayability because the player will notice that they have been through certain dialogue choices before. So that is the one downfall of convergent branching with partial convergence. The other downfall is it can be really hard to format, but in general, it is a very good strategy to have when you need information imparted. So for quest like dialogue, it's nice. Here's an example of it actually in practice, which may be a little overwhelming on the screen, but stay with me. Here we have the NPC say, and so here I am, an artist, or so I style myself. Now the player has two choices. If they choose 1.1, you're right, war paint is art, they will continue in a diagonal direction all the way down to end dialogue. And that will be their journey. If they choose 1.2, don't you feel you're limiting yourself? And the NPC then gets very defensive because that's very rude. The player has a chance to say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. That's right down there where the red arrow is. After the NPC's response, there's a little mark that says go to 11111. That will circle back up to where there's that little circled marking there and mean that the player finishes the dialogue in track A, in the red path, whatever you want to think of it as. So they don't have to continue all the way through the being rude about artists line, all the way down to the end dialogue on the second option there. They can rejoin their first path, the path that they left with their first choice. So that's convergent branching. Those three elements are really great ways to expand your dialogue away from the linear. Just know that each one is used in a different way. Convergent isn't necessarily great for standard dialogue, but it's good for quests. Finally, there are outs. Every time you write quest dialogue, you need to know that if someone is granting the player a quest, the player needs to have the choice to say no to the quest. You cannot force someone into a quest. So having a branch at the end of whatever dialogue you are engaging in that allows you to, as a player, say yes or no it's just mandatory. You've just got to have that. You can't strong arm anyone into playing a certain way. The other way, though, that there's an out that doesn't happen as often but is worth mentioning is if the quest is morally compromising or overly long. Hopefully not overly long, but if the player is going to be forced to do something that goes against their role play of their moral standards, for instance, if they are being asked to sacrifice their follower, Boethia, they need to be given the choice, even mid-quest, to back out, to fail the quest. Otherwise, it's just going to be in their journal forever, and that becomes a choice. I don't want to do that, as opposed to continuing the story, just continuing the story in a different way. So this does not happen that often, but if it does, know that this is not only okay, but recommended if you want to preserve the role play aspect of it. So those are outs. Hidden rewards. So we talked a little bit about checks, what they are. They're little barriers that keep you from moving forward. There are a whole bunch of types of checks. I would encourage you to pay special attention to the second type of check that we're going to talk about because it isn't used enough and it's really fun to incorporate. Standard checks are persuade, intimidate, and bribe. We have all seen these many, many times as players. You try a persuade, and if your skill level is high enough, then it gets passed, and if it isn't, then it doesn't, and then you continue along your way. Standard checks are not always interesting. They add a little bit of a coin flip element to your dialogue where you think, oh, yeah, maybe that'll work. And if you're a very high level, you know, of course it will work. And you can just go about your way, make that choice. Checks that are standard checks always appear, regardless of whether or not you're going to be able to pass the intimidate check. It will appear in dialogue as an option. So it's not hidden. It's just there tempting you. And that's fine, but it's not fascinating. It doesn't really inspire you to do things a different way or to try new things to force a new outcome. Still good to use, nice to have, but not really what makes the game fun. Faction status and event checks are what makes the game fun. So these are much more specific to what the player has actually done and experienced in their gameplay. Not just have you leveled up, but what have you done with your time? Have you just been growing potatoes, or are you actually a member of a certain faction? Have you done different things? So think about if the player is a member of the Dark Brotherhood. This is a faction check because it's related to the faction, Dark Brotherhood. And this option only appears if you are a member of the Dark Brotherhood. If you're not, it won't appear as a dialogue choice at all. So you don't know as a player whether these things are going to happen, whether you do get new options from joining a faction, from being in a certain location. You don't have that pre warning, which inspires you as a player to go back and try new things and talk to new people once you have joined certain factions, once you have completed certain quest lines. If things change after you have done certain things, you as a player want more. You want to know, ooh, now that I've completed the Civil War quest line, maybe her dialogue is different. And it is in Skyrim. If you think about the way that you can ask, like Adrienne in Whiterun, about what it's like now that the Stormcloaks have won, she will have unique dialogue and unique options because you have completed that quest line. This is good. This means that you are inspiring people to go back and try new things. Notice that your options here for faction status event checks can be something as fundamental as your race, being a Breton, being a high elf, but it can also be something as small as having certain equipment equipped, or what you decided to do a long time ago with escaping Helgen. Who did you decide to go with? Anything that is related to an event that you have experienced, a status like race or being married, or faction you have joined, can be turned into a faction status event check. These are so specific that they are not helpful in quest context, really, unless the quest is dependent upon you being a member of a certain faction. And they need to be used sort of sparingly, otherwise you're writing a whole bunch of lines that might not be used. But if there is a reason for a certain NPC to react to you being a member of the Companions or, the Thieves Guild, then by all means use that. It's what makes things more interesting. Here's an example of unlockable options using faction status and event checks. So the NPC is going to say, nothing quite like Riften, is there? And one assumes that there would also be standard dialogue choices for the player to say, yeah, it's a great city. But if the player is a member of the Thieves Guild, this option will appear. Oh, I know Riften quite well. You can pick up so many pretty things. The NPC then is pleased by this and says, well, if you need to get rid of those things, I'm happy to help you. Then option 1.1 locks, because you don't want the player to be able to say, oh, I know Riften quite well. You can pick up so many pretty things. Again, that doesn't make sense. Option 1.2 would then unlock, which would allow the player to then say, I have a few items that might be of interest to you, and for the NPC to act as a fence. So this is a great way to establish fences and other characters that have services that the player can use only if they are a member of a certain faction or have done a certain thing. There are a lot of other reasons to do unlockable options, but this is just a good example of how it could work. So your other option for unlockable things Unlockable dialogue. So this is when you have an entirely new dialogue set, not just one line, but the dialogue that you have been speaking with, the standard dialogue locks, and we get an entirely new set that opens up. This is quest related almost always. You wouldn't do this in standard. But if you have something like if the player has met Halfnir the Addled, which is an event, they can say, some madman was looking for you, I think. The NPC can get nervous and the dialogue, and the next time the player interacts with the NPC, the dialogue itself will be completely different. One assumes it will be related to Halfnir the Addled, because that's why you said that, but it will be, you will no longer be able to access what do you think about the city and other basic standard dialogue conversations until you finish with dialogue 2 and either accept or reject a quest or find out some information. These are really nice for revealing hidden quests that the player has to work hard to find. They have to interact with an NPC in order to find these things. Making it interesting. This is our last section. There are so many ways to write dialogue that help with flow and that establish a progression that still don't engage the player. And there are many different choices that could engage the player stylistically and in terms of what you actually decide to tell the player at certain times. So let's start with style. Check out these two things, these two styles of dialogue. Your first one, I do so enjoy pretty things, don't you? You've got these long responses, and they're very character specific. Of course, diamonds are Amir's best friend after all, or unless it's a pretty axe or a pretty sword, I'm not interested, or well, it depends. I mean, you have a lot that goes into these dialogues. Not that many characters that you are role playing fit exactly into this style because they are so specific. I mean, if you're playing someone who wants to say, I enjoy pretty things, but isn't either flirty or frivolous, what do you do? Those are your only options. So when you write in this style, you need to have a much broader base of options so that you're not forcing people to choose things that break their role play. You can't just leave it at a yes or no. Imagine if you just had, of course, diamonds are Amir's best friend after all, and unless it's a pretty axe or a pretty sword, I'm not interested. That would be two very different types of people, and maybe you're somewhere in the middle. Looking down at the other one, you have choices like, yes, I do too, depends on who's wearing them. No, not really. I prefer weapons to trinkets. These options are ostensibly more dull. They are not offering you as much character in terms of the roleplay. But they don't block roleplay either. They sort of toe the line down the middle. And if you don't have time to write 4 options or you don't think 4 options are necessary, you could narrow this down to 3 really easily. Or even 2, though try and stay away from yes and no options because they're just not as interesting. But you could get rid of either 2.2 or 2.4 and not be missing huge amounts of opportunity there. The top style number 1, is not Skyrim. It's much more BioWare games, things like Dragon Age. They tend to be a lot more character-driven in their player lines. If you're writing for Skyrim, it's generally a good idea to trend towards option 2 because it's easier to mesh up with different writing styles, and it will seem more familiar to the players than option 1 will. So in general, think that way a little bit more, but style 1 is still completely valid and a great way to go about things. Just know that you have to pick one of them. You cannot go back and forth. Otherwise, the player will be incredibly confused as to why sometimes they say not really no, and other times they go on and on.
Can I
So,
ask a question? I'm sorry for interrupting.
mhm.
It's allowed or not? Can both be implemented in a way? Like, is there a way?
No, because it's confusing to the player.
Okay.
So it really helps if you don't.
All right. Like in Skyrim system, it's you have to do something add on it, like to pick like in the Divinity, like there's like a bard or like tags for speaking. I guess it's not in Skyrim. Okay, so
Sorry.
thank you for answering.
So looking at these two styles, one is not necessarily preferable to the other, though Skyrim does favor style 2. But this is what's really important. Generic player versus generic NPC line. Take a look at this pair. You've got, this city seems vast and ancient with so much history in its very stones. Clearly, this person writing this decided to go with style 1, the much more florid, much more extensive style. And then you've got the NPC response, which is, yes, it's the oldest city in the realm and the largest. Lots of merchants trade here too. Unsurprising, really, given the size of the port. Now, where do you go from here? Well, the answer is nowhere. You can't go anywhere from there. What are you going to do? Talk about the size of the port? There's nothing to say. You've just, as a writer, put up a little barrier and forced yourself back to options. You have no other choice. Otherwise, why would the player care? They don't have any reason to do so, and you've told them nothing about the person speaking. Anyone could deliver that line. A child could deliver that line. An old person could deliver that line. You have nothing to go on. Now look at this one. You've got the most generic player line rather possible, which is, what can you tell me about the city? But then you have the NPC response, which is, it is a large place full of small-minded people. Do not expect to find compassion or understanding here. Such things are foreign to these Mer. Well, now you have someplace to go. You have so many things you could ask. You know a lot about this person who is speaking. She has a lot of issues. She's got a chip on her shoulder and you don't know why yet, but you could find out. So you can ask her more about her issue with the people who live in this city. You can remark that she doesn't actually seem to be from here, otherwise she'd be a little bit more forgiving of these people. You can defend the people of the city and say they're not so bad. Maybe you've just met the wrong people. You can say a lot off of this line. So when you have a choice, going with a generic player line and an interesting NPC line is always preferable, because the player line is just an intro, but the NPC line determines where you can go next. And if you block yourself off and you make sure that you have no options of where to go next that would be interesting and engaging to the player, you've lost an opportunity to build character, to build the world around you. It's much better to focus in on your NPCs and make sure that they are well-rounded and have a reason to speak and have something to say. Final thing, every question counts. We do not have the novel writer's time. We do not have an endless attention span for the player to hand us. We have to respect player time, how long they've been playing, how long they want to keep playing. We've got to be aware of spacing. If you have a very congested city, people can't stand around and talk for long periods of time because there are so many people to get through. The player will feel overwhelmed. But if it's one person in the midst of a woods, there you have more options. You also have spacing in terms of spacing out dialogue, as we talked before, having two lines, and then one line, things that will keep things moving. You have to be able to adjust for play style. Some people bullet through from the beginning to the end without looking left or right. Some people ask every question they can and then reload a save to see whether they can ask more questions. You have to adjust for that and be aware of the different types of players that are playing. And you have to see the larger picture, which just means Where does your dialogue fit in to the quest, to the city, to the entire world? What are you actually adding to this space? It can be small, it can be large, but what is it that you are adding? So that's it. We have 5 minutes left. If anybody has questions, now's the time. I'm just going to get back into Discord, so you will not be able to see this lovely question mark anymore. Questions?
I have a question.
Go for it.
Earlier when you were talking about things like direction in dialogue, I know Skyrim has its little compass rose that points you towards the quest. So is it ever worth it to be like, okay, I've been rattling on for a little bit, so I can tell them that the Ratway is under the city, or should I just mention that there's the Ratway and let the compass direct them to it, let them handle that part of the direction?
No, you can definitely do either, but I always find it better if I found out information naturally than if it's just been, quest markered on the map. Why would I know to go northeast? I don't know. But if a player has said, oh, there was a disturbance in the northeast, I think there were trolls or whatever it is, you can listen to that and then more naturally find it as opposed to having that player's internal perfect compass of being able to go anywhere because of the quest markers. So it's totally fine to do either.
Right. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I've got one.
Go for it.
Less of a technical question, more of like maybe a personal one. Have you had like a favorite sort of string of dialogue that you've implemented or written, or anything that you feel super you're just excited about?
Oh yeah, God yeah. I personally love writing NPCs because you can go in so many directions with them, and you can make them just serviceable to the player. Or if the player is interested, they can go on and on about their past. And there are ones that I've written for Alinor that become quite poignant, and you learn more about their history, and it changes the way that you see the city around you because you know how the people in that city have treated the people you spoke to. And I think that's one of the best feelings when you can change the player's mind about what they're seeing through dialogue. So, yeah.
Because we don't have enough time to write characters like we would do with short stories or novels, is there are there any specific tricks to bring like characterization to a higher level so that it'll be closer to the the quality or level of the other medium?
Yes, there are. And I actually did an entire lecture on specifically that you can find on YouTube from last month. Because yeah, I could go on forever on that. But yes, you still want your characters to be very full, even if you don't have the time to do the work of a novel would. But you still want them to be very much present and active and real people. And there are so many tricks to that. So yeah, worth doing.
Thank you a lot. I've just been here basically, and I have absolutely nothing to do. I have no knowledge of anything and how anything works. Sorry, I can't think super clearly.
You're good. No, welcome, and I'm glad that you could come. Yeah, the basics of like implementation of dialogue and the formatting of dialogue are a little different, but you can find those already. So I wanted to speak about dialogue in a more generalized sense, I suppose.
Feeling something or dialect or contractions or getting a
better sense of the person's voice in your ear and how much that's doable. Sorry, I missed the first part of the question, Netwit. What's your feeling about using dialect and contractions and getting a sense of the character's voice into your dialogue? How much do you like to use that, and how much do you think it should be more generic? I think you need to trust your voice actors. Personally, I think that if you write this character needs to have a Cockney accent, you don't need to write in the Cockney accent, because it is often harder for them to read that than it is for them to just go, yes, I know how to do that. So I think it doesn't need to be written out like phonetically or anything when you want a character to have an accent, but you just need to make it very clear in your NPC sheets and in the bits of information that you give at the top of a quest that this character sounds French or whatever it is.